Chapter 26. Eloise swore she was momentarily stunned at that moment, but with years of dating experience under her belt, she caught on to the man's subtlety within seconds, followed by a mixture of amusement and disbelief. Honestly, the term little boyfriend held no special meaning for her. Anyone younger than her could be called that. She didn't usually use the term to address others, only occasionally employing it for provocation. Her recent use of it toward that person was merely to express disdain. Wouldn't any guy feel annoyed being called a little boyfriend? So what exactly was Leonardo's problem? Isn't he your classmate? Isn't he younger than me? As Eloise spoke, the panic she had initially felt vanished, leaning casually against the car with an air of naturalness that only fueled Leonardo's growing irritation. He understood the logic, knew this was an ordinary matter not worth taking seriously. Yet he couldn't suppress the vexation and sense of loss from deep within. Starting from the moment he saw the man named Will express interest in Eloise, his emotions became abnormal. Exceptionally irritable, exceptionally annoyed. Just two insignificant trash, she needn't waste her energy or attention on them. But in reality, Eloise's field of vision never just contained him. Her world was colorful, unlike his, which remained pitch black. The only light in his life was given by her, like a solitary ship in the ocean finding its only harbor, a person walking alone in the snow gaining a single source of warmth, causing an involuntary over-reliance. Leonardo knew he seemed to be sick, increasingly so after meeting Eloise. Sensitive, quick to anger, losing his temper over trivial matters, all his focus constantly on her, every action overinterpreted, like now, over a mere matter of address. He was anxious to this extent. He almost forgot how isolated and helpless he once was. Yes, Will's appearance reminded him that he was such a despicable person, both in university and now. Would she be afraid? Given Eloise's qualities, she must attract many gazes, not only today's Will but also previous ones like Patrick. So, would her gaze always stay on him? Sorry. In the quiet parking lot, the man's voice echoed slightly. Within a few short seconds, thoughts raced through the man's mind like raging waves, almost drowning him. Eloise watched the man before her with an expression as if he had committed some heinous crime. After a moment, she couldn't help but laugh out loud. Leonardo was momentarily stunned, seeing the woman's radiant smile. The violent waves in his heart suddenly stilled, then retreated entirely after a second. What's so funny? The man's tone carried a hint of gritted teeth and frustration. Eloise stealthily glanced at Leonardo's expression, trying to suppress her laughter but failing after over 10 seconds. Leonardo looked down at the woman beneath him, an oddly twisted smile on her face, her shoulders occasionally twitching, completely devoid of the dignity and composure of Eloise she usually displayed. Muttering a curse under his breath, Leonardo had just retracted his hand propped on the car when the woman before him suddenly tugged on his tie, leaving him neither able to advance nor retreat. Leonardo, it seems necessary to educate you. Eloise spoke, her lips curved in a confident smile, her fiery gaze somewhat hard to withstand. In my world, there are two types of little boyfriends, one like your classmate just now, young and not very bright, true little boyfriend. The second is like you, good-looking and catching my eye. Her tone deepened as the woman extended another hand, lightly tapping the man's chest, saying, emotional little boyfriend. Leonardo's breath hitched, meeting the woman's aggressive gaze, unable to utter a single word. The Eloise before him was too dazzling, and those dark emotions lingering in his heart seemed to disperse like clouds under sunlight, vanishing bit by bit. So, don't be jealous over nonsense, okay? Hearing this, as if suddenly stepping on a tail, Leonardo snapped back to reality, coldly yanking his tie back, quickly stepping back 2 paces to maintain a safe distance of 1 meter from her. You're overthinking. The words sounded extremely ruthless, and the man, also lowering his head to tidy his disheveled tie, his expressionless face really did seem to be saying, she's overthinking. If his ears weren't so red, Eloise might have believed him. Eloise shrugged, understanding there's such a thing as knowing when to stop. Her gaze lingered on his reddened earlobes, but she didn't point it out, instead raising both hands in surrender. After leaving the mall, they went to a restaurant for dinner, and it was already past 9 when they returned to the apartment. On the way back, Eloise drove, glancing casually at the man in the rearview mirror, suddenly remembering the words Will had said in the cinema lobby. She knew Leonardo's family situation was not good. It was mentioned in the initial information, but there wasn't much about his college years. After all, her focus at the time was his current situation, not his past. Leonardo was a man with a story, but these stories shouldn't be told by others. If he wanted to share, he would tell her himself. According to the information, Leonardo had been an outstanding student at a university with excellent grades. College, a time of budding youth. With someone as good-looking and capable as Leonardo, he would undoubtedly be the white moonlight in many girls' hearts and a thorn in many boys' eyes. Eloise was not foolish. Her judgment of people was extremely sharp, so she guessed the identities of those two in the cinema lobby. Did that will often bully you at school? The quiet car interior was suddenly filled with the woman's voice. Leonardo sat in the passenger seat, his gaze darkening slightly upon hearing Eloise's question, his mind flashing through a few fragmented scenes. During college, in order to earn scholarships, he participated in many competitions just to earn comprehensive score points. The first time he met Will should have been at the Internet Plus internal school competition, where he and a girl named Tilly were team members, and Will was also part of the team. Tilly was a well-known department beauty in the journalism department at university, and Will had joined the Internet Plus competition just to chase her, with no substance in his belly, purely clinging to the team just to get close to her. This matter had nothing to do with Leonardo, but each competition was particularly important to him at the time, so when Will deliberately caused trouble for the third time just to attract the beauty's attention, Leonardo couldn't help but speak out in sarcasm. Later, the incident somehow reached the teacher's ears, and Will was kicked out of the team, resulting in a grudge between the two. Afterwards, Will learned that Tilly had confessed her feelings to Leonardo, which further fueled his hatred towards Leonardo, verbally abusing him whenever they met at school and sometimes even intentionally causing trouble at Leonardo's workplace. Will's family was wealthy, and after learning that Leonardo applied for poverty subsidies every semester, he spread the news all over the school, making the already friendless Leonardo an object of gossip. One was a rich and powerful young master, the other a poor student with no money or influence. Seeking advantage and avoiding harm is human nature. Even if Leonardo didn't do anything wrong, no one was willing to help out of fear of inadvertently getting into trouble. Those experiences weren't distant, and the situation of being isolated and helpless wasn't new. He had gotten used to it since he was 7 years old, and it had been like that ever since. "I don't know him, I've forgotten," the man replied in the car. "Forgotten?" Eloise raised an eyebrow, remembering Will's attitude in the cinema lobby, which clearly showed a deep hatred towards Leonardo, not the kind of don't know him level. "What about that girl next to him? Also your college classmate?" At this question, Leonardo pondered for a moment, then answered a few seconds later, "Classmate." "Just a classmate?" "Yes." Eloise lifted her eyebrows, glancing at the man in the rearview mirror, and the hint of unnaturalness in his eyes didn't escape her sight. Screech. The woman suddenly slammed on the brakes, and the red Porsche came to a stop, right in front of the apartment. The atmosphere in the car became somewhat strange, the woman's grip on the steering wheel unwavering, her slender fingers tapping on the black steering wheel lightly, once and again, causing a sense of tension in Leonardo. "Leonardo, you should know, kids who lie aren't very likable, huh?" At this moment, Leonardo seemed to have finally sensed something was wrong, his expression suddenly becoming extremely serious, and then he said earnestly, "She confessed to me." However, as soon as the words fell, Leonardo quickly added another sentence, "I rejected her." At this time, the man seemed to have suddenly come online with his survival instinct, but this explanation didn't seem to serve any purpose. "Oh, is that so?" The trailing end of her words was long, making Leonardo's heart tremble involuntarily. Given Patrick's looks, there must have been a lot of girls pursuing him in college, right? Eloise leaned slightly forward, her hand not leaving the steering wheel, and turned to meet the man's gaze, smiling brightly. "Did you date anyone?" "No," Leonardo denied reflexively, without any hesitation. And it was only after he finished speaking that he suddenly realized his behavior seemed a bit cowardly, followed by a darkening of his expression and his lips tightening into a straight line. Eloise took in the man's small actions, unable to suppress a chuckle. To be honest, she didn't care whether Leonardo had dated before or not. After all, she could talk about her own ex-boyfriends for 3 days and nights. How could she ask others not to have a past? She just wanted to tease him, and the man was as easy to hook as ever. "Get some rest early," Eloise said, as if suddenly remembering something, and continued, "If Jim abuses his authority to bully you, tell me, and I'll take care of it for you. Got it?" Leonardo listened to the woman's familiar tone, not replying, his silence making it impossible to guess his thoughts. Images of the first meeting with Jim came to mind, carrying a trace of confidence and ease similar to Eloise's. It's clear they've known each other for a long time, their years filled with overlapping experiences, areas he has never been involved in. After a simple farewell, Leonardo got out of the car, watching the fading silhouette of the sports car, standing in place for a long time, unable to snap out of it. It was late, and when Leonardo returned to the apartment, the dark living room was exceptionally desolate, the moonlight seeping in from the balcony lacking its usual gentleness, carrying a faint chill and oppression. In the silent room, a sudden ringtone broke the silence, the man's dull eyes flickering slightly, mechanically taking out his phone from his pocket and pressing the answer button. Before Leonardo could speak, a sharp and mean voice came from the other end of the phone. "Patrick, your uncle is tight on money lately. Send over $5,000 first." The man stood alone at the entrance, his grip on the phone tightening, his expression instantly returning to months ago, to the time before he met Eloise. Cold, empty, like a lifeless porcelain doll. "I don't have any." "No. How could you not have any? Where's the scholarship money you earned from studying before? Don't pretend with me here, boy." Familiar tone, unchanged attitude. Like leeches, clinging to you, sucking your blood endlessly, exhausting all means to drain you dry. After turning 18, he moved out of that house. He thought he could break free from that dark cage like this, but the nightmare followed him, and no matter how much he wanted to escape, he couldn't shake off his fate. He was the one abandoned by God, from beginning to end. "It's gone." Leonardo spoke, his tone neither sad nor joyful, without struggling or resisting, as if silently accepting all injustice and reality. He really didn't have any money left. Back in college, he participated in all kinds of competitions, earning all his prize money to subsidize his daily living expenses, saving all his money because of an accident 2 months ago. During his college years, he always transferred the money after receiving the call, giving a lot back and forth, and the desire grew stronger with each compromise. "Lad, you must have forgotten how much effort we put into raising you. 8 years, you don't even calculate how much we've invested in you. Now we're just asking for a little return, and you're turning your back on us here. Do you have a conscience? Has your conscience been eaten by a dog? Indeed, like father like son, your heartless nature is just like your cheap father's. If it weren't for you and your father back then, how could my daughter end up like that?" The sharp curses filled his ears, evoking the darkest memories hidden in his heart. His grip on the phone grew stiff, his face almost merging with the night, gradually sinking into the boundless darkness. After an unknown length of time, the other party seemed to have finally vented their emotions, coldly said, "Transfer the money to me tomorrow," and then hung up without hesitation. The disconnected beep-beep sound rang in the quiet room. The man slowly lowered the phone in his hand, silently standing in place, radiating almost drowning despair, like a silent wail. Yes, he seemed to have almost forgotten what kind of person he really was. Just a soiled person deeply mired in the mud. Why did he still want to come ashore? Why did he still want to become a clean person? His mind suddenly flashed with Eloise's face, like an extremely dazzling light, so fascinating. But he was surrounded by darkness. He wanted to get out, but no matter how much he struggled, he still couldn't escape this terrifying cage. So, how is someone like him, such a terrible person, supposed to like someone else? At that moment, the phone suddenly rang with a text message notification. Leonardo slightly lowered his head. The screen's white light fell on his face in this cold summer night, giving him a bit of warmth. Eloise, get some sleep early, good night. Chapter 27. You haven't been looking too good lately. Didn't sleep well at night? Jim observed the man in front of him, his usual indifferent expression tinged with fatigue, the shadows under his eyes rarely fading. Despite this, Leonardo's business acumen was indeed remarkable. Within just a week, he had thoroughly familiarized himself with all the industries under the company and had pointed out several project planning flaws with pinpoint accuracy. Not only did he excel in organizing and categorizing data, but he also meticulously arranged flight tickets and itineraries to an extent that exceeded Jim's expectations. Initially, he had high hopes for Leonardo, but as a newcomer, Leonardo was inevitably lacking compared to some professional assistants. However, in the nearly month that he had been working, Jim could hardly find any fault in him, with minor errors that were negligible, making him even more adept than his previous assistant who had been with him for many years. His former assistant had been by his side since his appointment, but he recently resigned due to getting married. After all, the position of president's assistant was quite stressful, often involving business trips, and could not take care of family matters, so the assistant chose family after weighing the options. Jim naturally understood his choice and gave him a substantial bonus upon his resignation. However, after that, he went through 3 or 4 assistants without finding a satisfactory candidate, which led him to finally consider Leonardo. After experiencing Leonardo's work capabilities, Jim often silently marveled to himself, where on earth did Eloise find such a gem? In a month, Jim had also gotten a general understanding of Leonardo as a person, knowing that he was emotionally detached, treating everything around him with a cold attitude, seemingly only showing a hint of warmth when facing Eloise. Recently, Leonardo had looked unwell, and as his superior, he shouldn't pry too much into an employee's private life. Moreover, Leonardo had never made any mistakes in his work, so although he had doubts, he hadn't asked. He also knew that with Leonardo's character, he would most likely remain silent, so asking would be futile, and he had delayed it until now. "I'm fine," Leonardo replied, as Jim had expected. "If your body can't take it, go home and rest for a day. In a couple of days, you'll accompany me on an inspection in City C. We'll have a tight schedule there, and if you're not well rested, your work efficiency will suffer," Jim said, closing the file in his hand and handing it to Leonardo. Leonardo froze for a second, but quickly recovered, yet he didn't mention taking a break, merely nodding silently. Seeing Leonardo's reaction, Jim naturally knew he hadn't taken his advice to heart, so he chuckled helplessly and continued, "Leonardo, you should know that if something happens to you here, Eloise will hold me accountable. She's very protective of those close to her, and if she sees you looking like this one day, she might suspect I've mistreated you." Hearing Eloise's name, Leonardo's eyes lit up slightly, and even his cold expression softened a bit. "I understand," he said, then prepared to leave the office with the file. "Oh, by the way," Jim suddenly remembered something and spoke up again. "Patrick's agent might come by to sign a contract later about the Yoko department store endorsement deal. Once he arrives, just bring him straight in." Leonardo's footsteps paused for a few seconds before continuing. "Understood." At 2 o'clock in the afternoon, Leonardo had just returned to the president's office from the finance department when he saw an unexpected visitor sitting in the reception area playing a game on his phone. The person wore a simple black hoodie and matching cargo pants, with an expensive pair of sneakers, a white snapback cap, looking very trendy. The game sound effects blared from his phone, and the boy was staring intently at the screen, his thumbs moving rapidly, with the situation appearing quite intense. Leonardo stood not far away, watching this uninvited guest, his eyes narrowing slightly, a glint of something unidentifiable flashing in his eyes, his expressionless face taking on a few more degrees of chill. He knew the person, and he had heard many times from others about the notable exploits between him and Eloise. Patrick. Why was he here? Wasn't his agent supposed to be the one coming to sign the contract? His mouth tightened, and a few seconds later, Leonardo approached the sofa. Before the game ended, he spoke up, "Here to sign the contract?" Patrick was in the middle of a team battle when he suddenly heard Leonardo's voice. Startled, he missed a critical skill, and the screen instantly turned gray. Anger surged, and he was about to curse when he looked up and met Leonardo's eyes, instantly calming down. This was a Line Corporation, not his own studio, and he couldn't afford to lose his temper like this. Patrick composed himself, exited the game interface, quickly locked his phone, and put it back in his pocket. The whole process took less than 10 seconds, but Leonardo still caught a glimpse of the fleeting photo. He froze for a moment, and when he realized what he had seen, his features sharpened, and a frigid aura began to overflow between his brows. Eloise, it was a photo of Eloise. Why did Patrick have a photo of Eloise? And why was it set as his lock screen? His mood surged like tides, an unbearable sourness rising, even his breathing rhythm becoming somewhat disordered. "I'm Patrick. My agent had a family issue, so I came to sign the contract myself," Patrick said, not noticing the man's abnormalities, and continued, "Is Jim in his office?" Leonardo's mouth tightened, and with difficulty, his rationality pulled his thoughts back. His voice was particularly cold when he spoke again. "Follow me." Leonardo led Patrick to Jim's office, and in that short journey, several fragments flashed through his mind, as well as snippets he had heard at the bar, his expression becoming increasingly dark. The office door was knocked, and the next second, Jim's voice came from inside, and Leonardo brought Patrick into the office. Jim looked up and saw Patrick, a hint of surprise flashing in his eyes. Then he subconsciously glanced at Leonardo, who was standing beside him. Sure enough, this kid's expression could probably freeze water at this point, huh? An amused smile crossed his face, and Jim put down his work, his hands clasped under his chin, hiding the not-so-obvious smile. "Why did you come in person? Where's your agent?" His kid suddenly fell ill, and he rushed to the hospital with the child, so I came to sign the contract myself, the boy said, standing in front of the desk, looking at Jim, feeling a bit nervous. Patrick naturally knew that Jim was Eloise's first love, but he also understood that the two were now just ordinary friends. Otherwise, with his impulsive and willful nature, how would he have taken the initiative to look for Jim? Besides, he was well aware that Jim's status was not on the same level as the few boyfriends Eloise had before. Jim was a proper president, in charge of the vast Line Corporation. Patrick thought that he was not inferior to the men Eloise had dated before, but compared to Jim, he still had some self-awareness. "Have a seat," Jim nodded, indicating for him to sit in the chair in front of the desk, then pulled out a file from the pile of documents and handed the already signed contract to Patrick. The contract was the final version after several rounds of discussions and negotiations, and an electronic version had been sent to Patrick's studio earlier, with both parties having reached an agreement. Today was just a formality to sign the contract. Patrick pretended to look it over briefly before signing his name at the end of the contract and handing it back to Jim. Jim glanced at it for a few seconds, confirmed everything was in order, and then handed the file to Leonardo standing beside him. However, unlike usual, instead of leaving in advance after receiving the file, the man remained expressionless, standing in place. Raising an eyebrow, Jim's gaze lingered between the two for a moment, unable to help but chuckle to himself. This guy is usually like a robot without emotions. Why does he suddenly seem to be jealous now? "Anything else?" Jim asked Patrick, who was in front of him. The man sat in the chair, hesitating for a while, his expression a bit strange, stuttering for a bit before blushing and asking, "Jim, can I ask you something?" Jim was slightly taken aback and said, "Go ahead." "I know you're quite familiar with Eloise, so I wanted to ask, who exactly has she taken a liking to recently?" As the words were spoken, the atmosphere in the office immediately tensed up, as if a flock of crows were flying by, cawing, and the air was filled with a faint sense of awkwardness. Jim's expression stiffened, and his gaze unconsciously shifted to Leonardo, standing behind Patrick's right. Leonardo seemed to be momentarily startled, but quickly regained his normally serious demeanor, as if nothing had happened. "Why are you asking this?" Jim said, turning to face Patrick's extremely distressed expression, his eyes filled with an indescribable complexity. "You know, I really like Eloise. After she rejected my confession, she told me she had someone she liked. But as far as I know, she hasn't been in a relationship for a long time, let alone anyone she likes." "That doesn't make sense," Patrick said, his expression earnest and a bit aggrieved. "Based on her past patterns, she should have found a new partner by now. It's been several months since she broke up with Carrie, and there's been no movement. That's enough time for her to have broken up again." Patrick analyzed this matter seriously, almost exposing all of Eloise's past. The more Jim listened, the more horrified he became. Seeing Leonardo's increasingly strange expression in the distance, he had an impulse to cover Patrick's mouth directly. Patrick, this guy, was too ruthless. "I suspect that Eloise's words were just an excuse to reject me. Given her temperament, she would never secretly date someone. So the reason of having someone she likes might be false." At this point, Jim couldn't help coughing lightly to alleviate his own embarrassment, then spoke with a stiff expression. "Why do you care so much about this? Whether she has someone she likes or not, she's not going to be with you." This statement was indeed cruel, and a trace of desolation flashed across Patrick's face. However, having heard similar voices so many times, he had developed immunity and recovered his original expression in just a few seconds. "Jim, just tell me, was Eloise lying to me?" Jim sighed softly, his gaze once again falling on Leonardo, then replied very seriously, "She wasn't lying to you. She does have someone she likes." The man's expression was momentarily stunned. Leonardo stood there, his grip on the documents tightening slightly, the chill on his face dissipating a few points, but his eyes showed a hint of confusion, unsure of what he was thinking. Upon hearing an answer he didn't want to hear, Patrick's expression became a bit awkward. After a few seconds, he forced out another sentence. "Who is it?" For someone like Patrick who liked to get to the bottom of things, Jim really couldn't handle it. He didn't know whether to call him stubborn or foolish. Some things should be left at that. Even if you probe to the end, it won't change the outcome. So why waste the effort? Moreover, the person Eloise liked was standing right behind him, wasn't he? "I don't know. You should go back now," Jim said, withdrawing his gaze and continuing with his work, his expression becoming extremely indifferent, clearly showing a stance of rejection. Patrick had no choice. He knew he couldn't get any results from Jim, so he stood up from his chair and prepared to leave. "Jim, then I'll be going." Jim didn't even look up, just hummed in acknowledgement, then said, "Leonardo, see him out." The man who had been silent all along nodded, pulled his thoughts back from his own world, and led Patrick to the elevator, seeing him off symbolically. However, just as he was about to turn and leave, he saw Patrick take out his phone from his pocket and dial a number. "Eloise, it's me." His footsteps stopped abruptly, his back stiffening. Although there was no expression on his face, his ears tilted slightly towards Patrick's direction. "Are you free tonight? Let's have dinner together." In the quiet corridor, the woman's cold voice came from the other end of the phone, exceptionally clear. "Not free." Hearing Eloise's ruthless rejection, the man's heart that had been hanging in his throat suddenly fell, a sweet feeling welling up from the bottom of his heart, wrapping around his heart bit by bit. "We haven't seen each other for a long time. Just one meeting, okay?" A new French restaurant opened in the city center. It's said to be very delicious. "I'll treat you." The man raised an eyebrow, silently grumbling to himself. Long time no see? French cuisine? Very delicious? Busy, hanging up. The next moment, the disconnected tone sounded. Rejected quite decisively, Patrick couldn't help but curse softly in the public setting. Leonardo glanced at Patrick again with an expressionless face, then withdrew his gaze a few seconds later and turned to leave, his eyes warming up a bit. After returning to the office, Leonardo took out his phone from his pocket, staring at the black screen for a moment before opening the messaging app. He rarely slacked off during work hours. This was one of the rare occasions. The woman's voice from the other end of the phone echoed in his ears just a few minutes ago, cold and merciless. It was not true that he wasn't happy. He admitted that he was selfish, feeling a bit gloating when he saw Eloise's attitude towards Patrick. But when he thought that one day, Eloise might reject him in the same way, how would he deal with it? Staring at the phone screen for a long time, the messaging interface darkened and brightened, brightened and darkened. His thoughts were churning, and suddenly, the scene from the office just now flashed through his mind. Jim said that she has someone she likes. How long can this kind of liking last? If she is inherently fickle, then what capital does he have to make her loyal to him? His eyes gradually darkened, and just as he was about to put the phone away, the darkened screen suddenly lit up again. A red appeared on the top of the chat box. Eloise, are you free tonight? Eloise, a new French restaurant opened in the city center. It's said to be quite good. Are you interested? Leonardo looked at the two new messages that had just been sent, and the clouds hanging over his brow instantly dissipated. However, a few seconds later, his expression suddenly stiffened. The French restaurant in the city center? Good taste? Who said it was good? Patrick? Leonardo, I dislike French cuisine. On the other end, Eloise, who was chatting with her little boyfriend during a break, raised an eyebrow slightly upon seeing the message and typed again, then let's have Korean cuisine. You cook for me. Half a minute later, the other party sent a good. Eloise hooked her lips and put the phone back on the desk, continuing with her work. She hadn't seen much of Leonardo recently. Eloise knew that he had just taken on the role of assistant at a line corporation, and there must be many areas he needed to adapt to. He would be busy, so she didn't bother him during the day, only occasionally chatting a little at night. If it weren't for the phone call from Patrick 15 minutes ago, she might not have remembered that it was time to meet her little boyfriend offline and increase their feelings. As for that French restaurant, of course, she had just heard about it from Patrick. Being such a busy person, she wouldn't have the leisure to pay attention to restaurant openings. The good taste was also said by Patrick, and since she thought he wouldn't lie, she mentioned it to Leonardo. She just didn't expect her little boyfriend to dislike French cuisine. At 6:30 in the evening, Eloise appeared at the door of Leonardo's apartment. As many times before, after entering, she changed into the pink slippers and sat down at the dining table without any reservation, waiting to be served. However, when Leonardo came out of the kitchen, Eloise noticed something was wrong with the man at first glance, and her brow furrowed, her expression turning cold. She hadn't noticed it at the door before, but now she realized something was off. His complexion was too terrible. Is it very busy at the company lately? During dinner, Eloise couldn't help but ask. Yes. The man's hand holding the fork paused slightly for a second before returning to normal, and there was no change in his expression. Eloise's frown deepened, but she didn't say anything more. Half an hour later, the two finished their meal, and Eloise sat upright on the sofa, typing on her phone with both hands, clattering away. Eloise, Jim, I now have reason to suspect you're exploiting your employees. Are you bossing Leonardo around just because you're the president? Jim, Eloise, you need evidence to make claims. A line corporation isn't a black-hearted enterprise. Where would we engage in such immoral practices? Eloise, then why is his complexion so bad? Jim, I'm puzzled too. I told him to rest today, but he refused. A set of footsteps sounded nearby, and Eloise immediately flipped her phone over onto the coffee table, looking at Leonardo in the distance, pointing to the spot beside her, saying sternly, "Come here." The man's footsteps paused, and he was stunned for 2 seconds, then obediently walked towards Eloise's direction and sat down where she pointed. Unexpectedly, as soon as he sat down, Eloise suddenly moved, pulling the man's head towards her with a jerk. Too sudden, before Leonardo could react, the world spun before him, and the next moment, he felt a soft touch on his cheek, extremely delicate, and his breathing was startled to a halt. The man was flabbergasted, lying with his head on the woman's lap, the warmth from the skin-to-skin contact constantly coming, burning his heart, a bit hot. His body suddenly tensed up drastically, but before he could struggle, a slightly cool hand pressed against his eyes. His vision immediately turned pitch black, yet so comforting. "Be good, sleep a little," the woman's voice sounded above him. Leonardo was stunned for 2 seconds, then unconsciously relaxed his body and slowly closed his eyes. Her voice was so gentle, with a hint of indulgence, that he simply couldn't stop his heart from gradually sinking. Fatigue engulfed him like a tide, and he didn't struggle at all, his unease and fear quietly dispelled. The familiar perfume scent lingered around his nose, so reassuring. Just like this, just 10 minutes, he only needed 10 minutes. Chapter 28. The man must have been exhausted, falling asleep within minutes of lying down. The living room sofa wasn't very large. Eloise sat on the far right while the man, who was over 6 feet tall, curled up on the small couch. His lean frame was clad in a simple t-shirt, and his bangs fell over his forehead. His sleeping face, free of the usual coldness and hardness, looked much softer, almost childlike, eliciting a tender affection. Even without his suit, Leonardo still carried a hint of boyishness. After all, he was only 23, not much older than her. Although she was just a year older, their upbringing had been vastly different. As the sole heir to QS Corporation, Eloise had been mingling with the upper echelons since childhood, witnessing too many plots and schemes. Her mind was inevitably sharper than that of her peers. There were many pitiful people around her, but she never felt excessive pity or sympathy for them. Only for Leonardo did she find herself inevitably feeling heartache. She sighed softly, the sound of the man's steady breathing filling her ears. Her hands rested on her knees, and her long, fine eyelashes and delicate facial features made her look endearing. Eloise felt her heart melt. Perhaps Eloise herself didn't notice, but her lips had been slightly upturned ever since the man fell asleep, and they hadn't dropped since. Her expression was softer than ever, and she occasionally played with the man's hair as time slipped away unnoticed. He was too trusting, wasn't he? Didn't he fear she might do something? With a soft chuckle, Eloise seemed to remember something and picked up her phone, which had been face down on the couch. She started snapping photos of the man's sleeping face, eventually settling on the cutest one and setting it as her phone wallpaper. Such actions were common among regular couples, but Eloise had previously found them childish, boring, and troublesome. Now, however, as she stared at her new wallpaper, Eloise raised an eyebrow, thinking to herself, "It's not as uninteresting as I thought. It's actually kind of fun." It wasn't clear how much time had passed when Leonardo awoke, groggy, to a completely darkened sky outside. Awake? Hearing her familiar voice, the man's sleepiness vanished instantly. He quickly sat up on the sofa, rubbing his forehead, trying to piece together the situation. Right, he had finished cleaning the kitchen and returned to the living room. Then Eloise had told him to sit on the sofa, so he did. And then the man turned abruptly to meet Eloise's teasing gaze. His cheeks flushed, and his expression became awkward. He bit his lower lip before speaking. "Sorry, how long was I asleep?" Eloise glanced at her watch on her wrist. "It's 10:10 now. You slept for 3 hours. At this, Leonardo's heart tightened. His gaze involuntarily fell on the woman's thigh, which bore a red mark from being pressed for too long. The skin was slightly indented, and guilt surged within him as he looked at the scene he had caused. Leonardo's expression tightened, but to Eloise, it was strangely amusing. Just woken up, The man's hair was disheveled, and his face was marked with red spots, looking quite undignified. Yet, his serious expression, all cute and fierce, made Eloise want to take more pictures. However, to spare her little boyfriend's pride, Eloise resisted the urge and beckoned him closer instead, gesturing with her finger. Still fuzzy from sleep, Leonardo simply tilted his head at her gesture and moved closer. In the next moment, Eloise suddenly cupped his face, her fingertips gently caressing his warm skin. She examined his complexion closely before smiling softly. "Your looks much better now." The man stiffened at her touch, a blush spreading from his cheeks to his ears, feeling warm and flushed. His gaze was flustered, and Leonardo avoided her intense stare, his trembling eyelashes revealing his flustered thoughts. Feeling the warmth from her palm, Eloise arched an eyebrow and leaned in further, stopping just a fist's distance away, whispering, "My leg's gone numb from you sleeping on it. How do you plan to make it up to me?" Leonardo's expression remained unchanged, but his eyelashes trembled even more. Eloise's voice carried a seductive tone, like a temptress leading her innocent boyfriend astray, each word laden with allure. In the next moment, Eloise blew a breath towards the man, and the already tense Leonardo shuddered. He then looked up sharply into Eloise's amused gaze, his beautiful eyes shimmering with shock and a hint of moisture, as if saying, "How could you do this to me? So innocent." Eloise's smile deepened, but she knew Leonardo's nature well. She had said that just to tease him, nothing more. Seeing her goal achieved and enjoying Leonardo's adorable expressions, Eloise was about to pull back when suddenly he acted, grabbing her wrist and pulling her towards him. Eloise hadn't expected him to react, especially since her leg was still weak. With no time to brace herself, she fell straight into his embrace. The next moment, a cool, fresh scent enveloped her as she landed in a warm hug. Her eyes widened as her face pressed against his chest, while his arms firmly wrapped around her slender back and waist, leaving no room for escape. The apartment suddenly grew quiet, all sounds fading away, leaving only the sound of his heartbeat, growing clearer. It was hard to believe that Leonardo, who looked so slender, had such a strong and reassuring chest. Before Eloise could gather her thoughts, Leonardo tightened his hold, then dipped his head, pressing his cool lips against her ear, and spoke in a magnetic voice, "Honey." Pop. It was as if fireworks exploded in her head, causing Eloise's pupils to dilate, her breath catching. After a few seconds, Eloise snapped back to reality. Her eyes darkened, like stormy seas, and the restraints seemed to crack and crumble. "Damn, I'm really losing it." Her leg finally recovered, and in the blink of an eye, Eloise pushed Leonardo down onto the sofa, turning the tide. Leaning over him, her hands on either side of his head, Eloise's expression was no longer playful. Instead, she gazed deeply into his eyes, her tone unusually serious. "Did you do that on purpose?" Leonardo didn't answer, just stared at her intently, as if denying her claim or silently enticing her. "Didn't I tell you not to provoke me like this? You said you wanted compensation." "So?" Eloise raised an eyebrow. "Leonardo, I'm not someone who's easily appeased." "What do you want then?" Leonardo said this without a hint of embarrassment, boldly surprising Eloise. Those things considered outrageous by day seemed less so at night. In the quiet apartment, the atmosphere grew increasingly intimate. Both could see their reflections in each other's eyes, a comforting feeling, like a breeze in April, soothing all fears and anxieties. The man lay on the sofa without any struggle, as if completely surrendering himself. "Be good." Eloise leaned down, her hand now supporting her on the sofa, bringing them even closer. Her hair fell beside his ear, making his heart itch. Leonardo didn't know what was happening to him. As if under a spell, his body and heart no longer obeyed him, only answering to the woman in front of him. Eloise bowed her head and pressed it against the man's forehead, speaking again in a voice tinged with a hint of coaxing, "Hold me." Almost instinctively, the man gradually raised his hands and wrapped them around her waist, their bodies pressing together without a gap, absorbing each other's warmth. His palms were drenched in sweat, and his heart was pounding at an unusual rate. He seemed to sense what was about to happen, his reason swallowed by emotion, and he could only be passively drawn by her words and actions, nervous yet tinged with an indescribable anticipation. "Good boy." A soft chuckle came from her, and the next moment, with the world growing dark, the man obediently closed his eyes, and everything seemed so natural. No resistance, no struggle, like a lamb willingly surrendering. Cool lips, hot breaths, and intense intimacy. Their lips met, and it was Leonardo's first true kiss, gentle yet passionate. His mind went blank, and his arms around the woman tightened, as if grasping the only buoy in a surging tide. All his senses focused on that one kiss, completely passive. He could only slightly lift his chin, bearing all her advances. One was an inexperienced young boyfriend, the other a seasoned bad woman. The dominant one was clear. After an unknown amount of time, the kiss finally ended. When the man opened his eyes again, the mist at the corners intensified, tinged with a faint redness, looking at the woman before him, as if unsure of his whereabouts. In his hazy state, he only saw the woman's lips curl slightly, filled with satisfaction and the arrogance of a victor, speaking into his ear. "Remember to do this next time, okay?" The trip to City C would take 3 days, primarily for on-site environmental research. In the coming years, Align Corporation intends to venture into the amusement park industry, aiming to establish a national chain of theme parks, with Y City and City C being their top choice. Additionally, Jim was invited to the birthday party of the president's daughter at Rocco International, scheduled for this Saturday, with the venue being Y City. Rocco International, as a prominent local tycoon in Y City, is a renowned jeweler providing raw materials for many domestic jewelry brands. Although Align Corporation does not engage in the jewelry industry, the interpersonal network is fluid, and the birthday party of the president's daughter at Rocco International, to some extent, could also be considered a small-scale business gathering. This business trip was initially planned for Jim and the head of the market research department, but Leonardo's inclusion was a last-minute decision by Jim. At 1 p.m. on Thursday, Jim, Leonardo, and the head of the market research department arrived at the international airport in City A, with 15 minutes left before boarding. Leonardo had not informed Eloise about the business trip, and he was unsure how to face her, especially after the kiss 2 days ago. So far, he seemed to recall every detail of that night, the soft touch, the hot breaths, and her patient and gentle guidance. Every time he thought about it, his heart uncontrollably sped up, a shameful shyness mixed with a faint joy lingering in his heart, like a fool. The woman's movements were extremely proficient, indicating experience. He knew that Eloise had been in many relationships, and it was likely that she had held and kissed other men like that night. He was not the first, and perhaps not the last. Without a defined relationship, that kiss was real, not forced, and though he didn't want to admit it, from start to finish, it was his own choice. So, what was she thinking? After that, Eloise acted as if nothing had happened, as usual, saying goodbye and leaving, not staying too long at the apartment, making him doubt if the kiss was just a dream. But the lingering perfume scent and the faint red on his lips indicated it was not. Leonardo felt he was a coward for the first time. After that, he didn't seek her out, and this trip to City C was also to escape for a while and cool down, hence he didn't inform Eloise. "Is it about time?" the head of the market research department suddenly asked. Jim. "Wait, there's one more person." Leonardo's eyes flashed with confusion, ready to ask when a familiar voice from behind made his back stiffen and he froze in place. "Sorry to keep you waiting." Jim glanced at Eloise approaching from a distance and then at Leonardo beside him, then chuckled lightly. "We're about to board. You timed that well." Eloise flipped her hair, removed her sunglasses, and fixed her gaze on the man who didn't turn around, saying, "Traffic was heavy." As soon as she finished, Eloise abruptly changed the subject, as if the previous answer was just a polite formality. "Leonardo the assistant, been a while, Don't recognize me now? Eloise said, her tone heavily laced with teasing, making Leonardo's expression darken, and he eventually turned around, coldly stating, Eloise. Eloise? Why was this little boyfriend so quick to deny her? 2 days ago, he was calling her honey, and now it was just Eloise? The woman narrowed her eyes, a glimmer of darkness in them, and after a meaningful, she didn't continue the conversation. Eloise understood that Leonardo seemed to not want others to know about their relationship, making her doubt her charm, but after thinking it over, she accepted the situation. After all, she preferred clear boundaries between work and private life, and given her status as a suitor, being too high-profile wasn't her style. She could be wild privately, but she had to be serious during work hours. Boarding began, and as Leonardo hoped, Eloise treated him like a stranger, chatting amiably with Jim side by side, completely ignoring the two behind them. Leonardo watched the woman's smiling face, his expression growing colder, his gaze fixed on her smile, a sense of annoyance and frustration rising in his heart. Eloise and our Jim seem quite a match, the head of the market research department suddenly remarked. Hearing this, Leonardo frowned sharply, a trace of anger in his expression, coldly retorting, "You're mistaken." The head of the market research department was slightly stunned, glancing at Leonardo's assistant, whose gloomy expression was almost frightening, and swallowed back the words he was about to debate. Was Leonardo the assistant out of sorts? Meanwhile, Jim sneakily glanced at Leonardo behind him, seeing his assistant's face as dark as a skillet, feeling a bit helpless. "Are you two sulking or dragging me into it?" Eloise didn't turn back, only responded indifferently, "No personal feelings during work hours." "No personal feelings?" Jim raised an eyebrow, almost amused by her statement. "So who was the one who called him the other day? And who asked for flight information after learning Leonardo was also going on the trip? Wasn't that what she meant by no personal feelings? Why is Eloise here too?" The head of the market research department suddenly asked, and Leonardo's eyes flickered, showing interest in the question. "The birthday party of the president's daughter at Rocco International. She's also on the guest list," Jim explained, his gaze shifting between Eloise and Leonardo, a hint of amusement in his eyes. "Oh, I see." The head of the market research department nodded in realization. At this, Leonardo's eyes dimmed slightly, carrying a trace of undetected disappointment. It seemed this was just a coincidence. 10 minutes later, boarding officially began. The tickets were booked by Leonardo, initially only for Jim and the head of the market research department. His own ticket was added later. However, when he followed the seat number on the ticket, his steps halted abruptly in the aisle next to the seat. Seeing Eloise sitting by the window, Leonardo's expression faltered, his lips parted, his thoughts momentarily complicated. And Eloise, who seemed to have noticed the movement, shifted her gaze from the window and looked at the man standing still, her lips curving slightly, teasingly saying, "Leonardo the assistant. What a coincidence." Leonardo. He now had reason to suspect that this was not a coincidence, but someone's premeditated plan. Chapter 29. The cabin was unusually quiet, with the two of them seated side by side near the rear. After the initial, "What a coincidence," the woman had turned her head back to the window, as if genuinely planning to act throughout the journey as though they were strangers. The atmosphere grew awkward. Leonardo sat quietly in his seat, his expression unreadable, his eyes cast downward, appearing calm on the surface, but surging with hidden emotions. Eloise's demeanor was exactly as he had hoped, yet for some reason, he felt a faint sense of irritation and a feeling of being wronged. Being on the same flight and sitting next to each other seemed to him clearly the result of someone's deliberate actions. What was her purpose? Just before boarding, she had been chatting merrily with Jim, but with him, she remained silent. But it wasn't always like this. Previously, she never missed an opportunity to tease him, often pushing him to the point of blushing before she'd stop. So why was she silent now? Or perhaps, after their last kiss, she had lost interest? A skilled hunter always has a strong desire to win. Before capturing their prey, they pour in high enthusiasm and dedication, finding excitement and thrill in the chase, enjoying these emotions. Yet once the prey is caught, they quickly feel a sense of emptiness. Was she now considering the kiss as having caught him and therefore felt indifferent? It felt like being abandoned. Leonardo had a momentary illusion that Eloise was like those ancient, philandering noblemen who, after wandering through brothels, would toss silver and leave, leaving him to be tormented by various emotions. As the man's complexion grew darker, the silent woman beside him finally spoke, breaking the silence. "Why didn't you tell me about the business trip?" The man was slightly taken aback. His thoughts, which had been swirling in a vortex, were suddenly pulled back. He wanted to say something but found he had nothing to explain. Could he not say it was to avoid her? In the next instant, a soft chuckle suddenly sounded beside his ear. Just as Leonardo was about to turn his head, his shoulder suddenly felt heavy. The man stiffened, his gaze instinctively shifting to the front row, where Jim and the supervisor Jiang didn't seem to notice them. He let out a silent sigh of relief but remained on high alert. "Eloise. Didn't you call me Eloise?" Leonardo paused for a moment, then pursed his lips, his ears tinged with a faint blush of red. "I'll settle the score with you later," Eloise said, moving her head to find the most comfortable position. "Wake me up when we land." Leonardo didn't dare resist, nor did he want to. Just a simple gesture and a few ordinary words, yet the troubles that had plagued him for days disappeared instantly. It was somewhat resigned. All his emotions were swayed by someone's actions. Such feelings were exhilarating like possessing the world when happy, yet devastating like being abandoned by the world when sad. Like a roller coaster, up and down, uncontrollable, oscillating between pain and joy, yet he seemed unwilling to get off this ride. Glancing at Eloise, she seemed not to have put on makeup today, her natural look more innocent than usual. Her dense eyelashes cast down, concealing all her boldness. She must have not rested well. There was a slight tint of dark circles under her eyes, probably due to the heavy workload at the company recently. Seeing this, a hint of heartache flashed through Leonardo's eyes. He pursed his lips and obediently relaxed his body, adjusting his posture to make her sleep more comfortably. Eloise indeed hadn't rested well. 2 days ago, she had called Jim intending to ask about the birthday party of the president's daughter of Rocco International. As they talked, she learned that Leonardo was also on a business trip. She felt somewhat displeased, wondering why Leonardo hadn't told her about the trip. But then she thought, Leonardo's nature was inherently introverted. Moreover, they had kissed. She felt it was nothing, but for Leonardo, it might have been overwhelming, and not reaching out to her was understandable. Besides, their relationship wasn't officially that of a couple yet, so Leonardo didn't have the obligation or reason to report his itinerary to her. But since they had already kissed, formalizing their relationship should be a priority. After all, she, Eloise, wasn't the type to turn her back on someone. Having taken advantage of her innocent boyfriend, she should take responsibility. Thinking this, Eloise quickly booked a ticket with Luke and managed to handle most of the company's affairs within 2 days, rushing to the airport. It was exhausting, staying up late into the night, but the thought of going on a business trip with her boyfriend excited her. To be honest, such teenage girl emotions were rare in her life, and the experience of staying up all night for an outing with someone from the next class had never occurred to her. But she didn't expect that meeting Leonardo would bring her all those unexperienced, seemingly impossible situations. After a 2-hour flight, the group arrived at their pre-booked hotel. Eloise still wasn't fully awake, looking dazed since landing, perhaps due to a bed-induced sullenness, her expression rather gloomy, suggesting an unhappy mood. Initially, Jim thought Eloise was upset due to a quarrel with Leonardo, but when he approached to ask what happened, Leonardo suddenly stepped in, preempting Eloise's explanation. "Eloise didn't rest well last night, Jim. It's better not to disturb her." Jim's expression faltered as he glanced again at Eloise, noticing her tired complexion. He then shifted his gaze to Leonardo's serious demeanor, raising an eyebrow with a meaningful look. The hotel was booked by Leonardo. While he was checking in, he discovered Eloise's room was right across from his. He didn't know what to say, feeling completely controlled, but the joy rising from the depths of his heart seemed to affirm a hard truth. He didn't dislike this feeling of being slowly consumed. By the time they reached the hotel, it was almost evening. After dinner, everyone returned to their rooms. Eloise, possibly exhausted, waved casually during their goodbyes and entered her room without looking back. The next morning, when Leonardo stepped out of his room, he glanced at the closed door next to his lips tightening, a hint of worry flashing across his face. He hesitated at the door for a long time, his hand about to knock when his phone rang, interrupting him. He eventually withdrew his hand and headed downstairs. The day was packed with activities. They visited the site in the morning, negotiated with local government departments in the afternoon, and after visiting several locations, they returned to the hotel at around 8 p.m. Leonardo, exhausted, stood at his room door, the first thought in his mind being Eloise across the hall. His gaze fell once more on the closed door, and after some thought, he frowned and decided to knock. However, it seemed no one was inside. Leonardo knocked for a while with no response. A sudden sense of irritation welled up inside him. He reached for his phone to call her, yet his finger hovered over the dial button, unable to press it. He didn't dare, unsure of the identity with which to show concern. He sometimes deeply loathed such a cowardly self, yet he couldn't escape these feelings, only constantly self-loathing. After an unknown amount of time, Leonardo finally put away his phone and turned back to his room. However, as he opened the door, instead of darkness, the room was brightly lit, and the person he wanted to see was sitting on the sofa not far away. The woman noticed the movement at the door, slowly turned her head, and raised an eyebrow, naturally saying, "Hey, you're back." Leonardo stared at Eloise from a distance, his hand on the door handle suddenly losing strength. The door, no longer resisted, slowly closed, ending with a bang. The room became a sealed space, and the atmosphere grew slightly awkward. "Why are you here?" Leonardo said, his expression still carrying a hint of surprise. Eloise, in front of the man, pulled out a black room card from her casual outfit pocket, showing it to him generously, then calmly said, "I have a key card." Leonardo looked at the card, his face darkening, feeling incredulous. When Jim booked the hotel, he said not to consider the budget, so he reserved a room at Walter Hotel, which is one of the top 5-star hotels in the country, renowned for its environment, service attitude, and privacy. So, why does Eloise have a key card to his room? Could it be that she owns the entire hotel? However, as if sensing his thoughts, the woman slightly raised her eyebrows and explained again, "Oh, I forgot to mention, Walter Hospitality is one of the properties of QS Corporation. So it really is her family's hotel." Silent for a moment, Leonardo seemed to have accepted reality, his expression becoming more restrained, and then he asked, "Is there something you need?" "You forgot," Eloise said, putting the card back into her pocket, leaning against the sofa, her every move exuding a subtle laziness and a seductive charm from within her bones. She slightly curved her lips, her eyes carrying a hint of bewitchment, and finally said in a teasing tone, "I've come to settle the score with you, haven't I?" Leonardo was slightly startled, immediately recalling the scene on the plane, and then his face stiffened, inexplicably starting to feel nervous and uneasy. He had thought it was just a simple joke. After all, Eloise had fooled him with such words many times before. "Come here," Eloise said, her tone carrying an undeniable authority. Leonardo frowned, but after a moment, he still walked towards Eloise. However, just as he approached the sofa, the woman who had been lounging suddenly moved, grabbing the man's wrist and pulling him down with a forceful tug. As if rehearsed 1,000 times, the woman straddled the man's lap as he fell onto the sofa. Before Leonardo could react, his neck tightened as the woman wrapped her arms around him, and their distance suddenly became very close. The room was filled with a sultry atmosphere, their breaths intertwined, and after a moment of stunned silence, Leonardo seemed to gradually get used to Eloise's sudden actions. "Compensate me, the woman said, slightly raising her eyebrows. Today, Eloise was off work, having shed her usual professional attire, wearing only a loose t-shirt and sports shorts, her fair and smooth skin exposed, a bit dazzling to the eyes. Just like yesterday, Eloise was not wearing makeup, her bare face accentuated only by a touch of lipstick to brighten her complexion. She appeared less glamorous than usual, but no less sexy. Leonardo locked eyes with Eloise's aggressive gaze, and hearing the word compensation, an image of their kiss on the sofa suddenly popped into his mind. Night sofa, both elements were present, leaving only the final piece, the kiss. His face flushed hot, and he slightly turned away, his expression seemingly unhappy, as if he wanted to cover up his panic and shyness with a cold demeanor. "No." Eloise pursed her lips, her arms around the man's neck shifting to cup his face, forcing him to look at her, and then speaking with a serious expression, "Why not? Was I not good at kissing you last time?" Like a fire that had ignited from the soles of his feet to his head, the man's face instantly turned bright red, and he grabbed the woman's wrist with a fierce look in his eyes. The next moment, a roar erupted in the quiet room. Chin, one. Feeling the heat in her palm, Eloise knew he was embarrassed and furious, so she curved her lips, the amusement in her eyes growing than before. "Why not call me Eloise again?" Eloise said, her thumb rubbing the man's skin in a rather lewd manner. Then she couldn't help but inwardly marvel, how can his skin be smoother than a woman's? "Eloise, stop messing around." Leonardo gripped the woman's hand tighter, but he did not intend to pull her down, as if issuing a warning, but also filled with indulgence. "Tisk." Eloise withdrew her hand, feeling somewhat bored, then got off Leonardo and sat on the other side of the sofa. "I thought you enjoyed it that night. Why are you reluctant now?" Leonardo stiffly sat in his original position, the heat in his face reaching an unimaginable level, and every word Eloise said seemed to challenge his limits of embarrassment. The woman spoke so brazenly, uttering one shocking phrase after another in a casual manner, leaving him flustered and at a loss, his heartbeat and breathing going out of control. "I didn't." It seemed he had finally found his voice, the man covering half his face with one hand, his head turned away from the woman, trying to appear a bit calmer. However, his red ears betrayed his thoughts completely. "Have you eaten yet?" The man changed the subject awkwardly, and Eloise turned to look at him, watching the taut line of his jaw and his flushed earlobes, the amusement in her eyes undiminished. The man in the white t-shirt, with his shirt tucked into his black trousers, appeared even more alluring with his long legs. His buttons were fastened neatly, giving off a sense of restraint, evoking an urge to tear his clothes apart. To be honest, Eloise had dated serious men before, like Jim, who were elegant and refined and indeed handsome in their shirts. Yet, their appeal paled in comparison to a single glance of Leonardo's back. "What if I've eaten?" "I know what I want now, anyway," Eloise said, seeing the man's body tense up. Upon witnessing the man's reaction, Eloise couldn't help but find it amusing. Then, pretending to be angry, she stood up from the sofa and said, "Boring, I'm leaving." However, just as she was about to pass the sofa, the man who had been playing dead suddenly moved, grabbing Eloise's hand and shifting from passive to active. Although she had anticipated this, Eloise was still a bit stunned when she found herself straddling the man's lap again. The hot hand fiercely gripped her waist, and despite the layer of clothing, she could still feel the unusual heat from his palm. The man kept his head lowered, his forehead resting on the woman's shoulder, as if thinking that his expression would not be noticed this way. Eloise's hand hovered in the air for a moment before gently resting on the man's shoulder. "Eloise, don't tease me like this." The man's voice carried a tone of compromise and pleading, like a pitiful little boyfriend clinging to his owner, afraid of being abandoned one day. Eloise was slightly taken aback, then her hand on the man's shoulder shifted to cradle his head, her slender fingers weaving through his dark hair, stroking it over and over, as if playing or offering silent comfort. "What are you afraid of, Eloise asked. The next moment, the hand around her waist tightened even more, as if breaking through some barrier and restraint, boldly pressing his head closer to the woman's shoulder, burying himself in her collarbone, greedily inhaling her scent. What was he afraid of? He was afraid that she would really leave him, afraid that she would really walk away without hesitation, afraid that she would take away the only light in his life. Of course, he was scared. He thought he had nothing left, thought he had nothing to lose, but only now did he realize he was still afraid. He still had attachments to this world, to her. The man remained silent, responding to her questions in his heart. He still lacked the courage, still dared not admit how pathetic he was at this moment. Time seemed to slow down at this moment, and all the noise around them gradually faded, leaving only the embrace and warmth of each other as the only real things. "Did I scare you?" Eloise asked softly, her tone filled with unprecedented indulgence and gentleness, as if she had endless patience to play with him until the end of time. "How about some compensation?" As soon as the words left her mouth, the man's whole body jolted, and the next moment, his stubborn voice came through, muffled and tickling her skin. "No." Eloise chuckled and gently kissed the man's hair. "Really don't want it?" Another jolt, the man's hand around her waist tightened even more. "No." Her hands moved down from his head to cup his face, and she kissed him on the forehead again. "Are you sure you don't want it?" This time, the man did not answer, only lowered his eyes, naively thinking that he would not be discovered by the other in such a way. His flushed cheeks, trembling eyelashes, and teary eyes, perhaps Leonardo did not know how charming and delectable he was at this moment. Unable to help but curse inwardly, driven by impulse, Eloise turned into a beast without reason, her sense of guilt becoming a stimulant, while her mischievous nature restrained her urge, luring the man step by step, disarming him, taking off his armor, and gradually conquering his defenses, forcing him to surrender. Leaning against the man's forehead, Eloise's face carried the composure of a dominator, a faint smile on her lips, and the next moment, her lips moved to his eyelids. "An untruthful little boyfriend doesn't win my favor, you know." The woman's kisses trailed down. Just when she was about to touch his lips, she abruptly stopped. "One last time, are you sure you don't want it?" However, the moment the words fell, a whisper as faint as a mosquito's buzz sounded, and in the quiet room, it clearly entered Eloise's ears. "I do." Almost as soon as the words left his mouth, their lips met, igniting a spark of their own in the closed room, hot and intense. This kiss was especially lingering. Afterwards, Eloise elegantly wiped away the smudge of red from the man's lips, meeting his almost dazed eyes, and praised. "Good boy." Chapter 30. The following noon, the quartet dined at the Walter Hotel's restaurant, where an eerie silence hung in the air. Jim glanced at Eloise, who was eating with her usual refined elegance, as if nothing out of the ordinary had happened. Next, his gaze shifted to Leonardo, who, though still maintaining a stern demeanor, seemed unnaturally tense. Being privy to their situation, Jim refrained from speaking much. Meanwhile, Supervisor Jiang, unaware of the tension, continued to flatter with a cheerful tone. "Walter Hospitality, under QS Corporation, sure knows how to impress. The stay has been delightful, and the food rivals that of Michelin-starred restaurants." Eloise responded with a polite yet distant smile, her tone formal. "You flatter us, Supervisor Jiang. If there are any shortcomings, please feel free to mention them. There's always room for improvement at Walter Hospitality." At this, Leonardo's hand paused, a subtle, unnatural shadow passing over his eyes. He found himself unable to look at certain words, like compensation and comfort, without their recent connotations making him tense reflexively, conjuring vivid memories. Meanwhile, having finished his meal, Jim set down his cutlery and leisurely wiped his mouth before slowly beginning, "Tonight at Rocco International." But before he could finish, Eloise interrupted. Oh, speaking of which, I need to borrow someone from you, all right? Eloise set down her own utensils, smiling at Jim with a look that, despite its warmth, was void of genuine amusement and hinted at a threat, as if daring him to disagree. Jim was momentarily taken aback, but soon chuckled, recalling how Eloise always got what she wanted. His gaze unconsciously drifted to Leonardo, who was frozen mid-action. With a light chuckle, Jim agreed. Given Eloise's request, how could I say no? Good. Eloise's smile became a bit more genuine. I want to go shopping this afternoon and need your assistant to carry my bags. Just bags. Jim raised an eyebrow, his playful tone clear. Eloise smiled but remained silent, leaving her intentions unspoken yet obvious. Leonardo, who had been silent throughout, thought to himself, has anyone even asked for my opinion? In the September heat, Eloise wore a simple t-shirt and a skirt, looking younger than her usual corporate attire. At work, Eloise was known for her decisive actions, whether pointing out flaws in project plans or making critical business decisions, all with a seasoned sharpness. Few remembered she was only 24. She was strikingly beautiful, her casual outfit doing little to hide her allure, drawing glances from passing young men. The third time this happened, Leonardo's face darkened, his fists clenching involuntarily. His gaze fell on her exposed legs, his expression grim, clearly displeased. It was almost winter. Why wear such a short skirt? Did she want to experience rheumatism in old age? Leonardo initially thought Eloise's shopping was a pretext. But when she genuinely spent 40 minutes browsing the mall, his expression soured. The two young men trailing them caught Leonardo's attention. When one approached with a phone, Leonardo quickly grabbed Eloise's wrist, halting him. What's wrong? Eloise asked, meeting Leonardo's brooding gaze, then glanced at the young man, understanding dawning. Had enough yet? Leonardo's voice was icy with impatience. Eloise merely laughed, pulling his hand down and intertwining their fingers. How about now? She asked, her fingers gently stroking his hand. In moments, their tension dissolved. Leonardo looked at their joined hands, his anger abating slightly, though his lips remained tight. No words were needed, his silence answered her. In front of the young men, Eloise led Leonardo into a luxury boutique, ignoring everyone else. Inside, they were the only customers. Eloise promptly directed, pick out a suit for him. The staff, professional and quick, ushered them to sit while preparing options. Leonardo, confused, asked, what are you doing? Buying you clothes, obvious. Eloise replied casually, her demeanor exuding confidence. No, thank you. Leonardo refused. Oh! Eloise leaned closer, teasing, really? Before he could respond, she added, or would you prefer I invite Jim as my date? His refusal caught in his throat. Leonardo's expression darkened further. Eloise's smile widened as she whispered in his ear, or find a new boyfriend at the party? Leonardo's hand tightened on the sofa, his frustration evident. In the fitting room, Leonardo paused, considering the suit. As he began to change, the curtain suddenly moved, and Eloise entered. Startled, he grabbed a shirt to cover himself. Eloise, are you crazy? She stepped closer, her finger against his lips, playfully. Leonardo, the assistant, don't want everyone to know what we're doing in here, do you? Upon hearing this, Leonardo's face instantly flushed a deep red, his grip on his shirt tightening as he glared at Eloise as if she were some kind of world-class rogue. The man's lips were pressed tightly together, his expression tense, as if holding back an immense fury. Yet when he spoke again, his voice was surprisingly soft, laced with a hint of gritted teeth. Get out of here. Eloise's eyes flashed with surprise, and an image suddenly popped into her mind from a few months ago, when she had forcibly kissed him in the hallway of a bar. Since then, he rarely shouted at her like this anymore. However, Eloise felt no anger at being yelled at. Instead, her interest grew stronger, a sly smile playing on her lips as she spoke teasingly, "Little boyfriend, your heart is so cruel." Her fingers trailed slowly down from the man's lips, landing on his delicate collarbone. A wild glint flashed in the woman's eyes as she ignored the tremor in the man's body, her fingers continuing to move boldly downward, tracing over the slightly bulging chest, raising goosebumps. The man's face grew increasingly dark, and just as he was about to explode, the woman suddenly grabbed the shirt in front of his chest, as if wanting to remove the troublesome item. Leonardo's heart tightened, and he hastily clutched the shirt in front of him, looking as if he were grasping his last lifeline. Meeting the woman's fervent gaze, Leonardo's heart raced even more, the sense of being targeted by a hunter making him shudder involuntarily. He even began to suspect that Eloise might really want to take him right here and now. "Eloise, what exactly do you want to do?" Compared to Leonardo's panic, Eloise seemed exceptionally calm. She simply glanced at the shirt he was clutching and spoke slowly, "This suit is worth $100,000. If you rip it." Before Eloise could finish, the man abruptly released the shirt, his movement swift and decisive, like a conditioned reflex after being burned. A light chuckle echoed in the changing room, and Leonardo's face grew dumb. The expression on his face was more distressed than ever before. He felt he had been played, but now the shirt was in the woman's hands, and he could only stand there like a fool. Stripped of his cover, the man's bare chest was completely exposed to the air. The smooth lines of muscle were more appealing than she had anticipated, not two large biceps, half a V-line disappearing into the dark trousers, and although the six-pack was not particularly prominent, they were distinct. Still carrying a touch of youthful innocence, yet not lacking in maturity and sex appeal. The man's figure, though not as standard as a male model's with well-defined muscles, seemed to perfectly align with her aesthetic preferences. Eloise's gaze grew up, unabashedly lingering on the man's body, her strong predatory nature making Leonardo feel an urge to cover up, yet he stiffened in place. The dignity of being a man apparently didn't allow for such behavior. "Haven't you seen enough?" the man said coldly, struggling to control his impulse to throw the woman out. Eloise, who had just laid eyes on such a sight, was not ready to quit so easily. She let out a flirtatious whistle, her eyes still full of mischief, and continued, "How could I ever get enough?" With that, the woman took a few steps forward until she was less than a fist's distance from Leonardo, then slightly tiptoed, "I'll never get enough in this lifetime." The man's pupils constricted, and he turned his head away after a couple of seconds, silently thinking to himself, "Smooth talker. A lifetime? Already talking about lifetime matters?" If she saw a better-looking man with a more impressive physique in the future, wouldn't she just turn around and leave? Although the man thought this in his heart, his reddened ears and flickering pupils betrayed his inner joy. Sweet words are like this, always denying their authenticity, but still feeling delighted upon hearing them. "You've gained some weight. Looks like you've been obedient," Eloise said, nodding very seriously, her expression and attitude making Leonardo feel even more embarrassed. Indeed, ever since Eloise mentioned she liked V-lines and abs, he had consciously paid attention to this aspect. However, his daily work was not simple, and there was no fixed time to exercise himself. He had imagined that one day, perhaps in some situation or at some time, he would reveal his excellent side in front of her. But that would be under circumstances where he was fully prepared, not like now, being seen through without any warning. It was as if he had been forced to present a half-finished product in front of the judges. Thinking of this, a sense of frustration rose within the man. Eloise didn't notice his abnormality, her gaze strangely drawn to a small mole in the man's collarbone dimple. Her throat tightened, and her gaze grew tighter as she spoke, her voice dangerously seductive, with a hint of subtle hoarseness. "Leonardo, shall we do something bad?" The man immediately turned his head, staring in shock at the woman in front of him. His body's instinctive reaction made him retreat again in panic, but the woman didn't give him a chance to escape, following closely, step by step, cornering him. His back suddenly pressed against the wall, a chill spreading, but not enough to counteract his current heat. Completely cornered, the man's Adam's apple bobbed. "Eloise." Before he could get a word out, Eloise's hand suddenly covered the man's mouth, silencing the rest of his words. In the next moment, the woman lowered her head slightly, her cool lips pressed against the light brown mole, causing the man to shudder, all his hairs standing on end. The originally fair skin seemed to be instantly dyed, a flush spreading rapidly from his neck, with a trend of continuing downward. His mind felt like it was suddenly blasted apart, blank for a moment before Leonardo snapped back to reality, pushing the woman away fiercely, not caring about being discovered by the staff or anything else, directly shoving her out of the changing area. Leonardo. Eloise had barely kissed for a moment before being pushed out of the changing booth by Leonardo, dumbfounded. Meeting the man's unusually furious gaze, Eloise's heart sank, knowing that he was truly angry. Just as she was about to start placating him, he snatched the clothes with a cold expression, then, swish, pulled the curtain closed again, clearly refusing to engage in any conversation. All right, she had really made her little boyfriend angry this time. The birthday party of the daughter of the Rocco International CEO was held at a suburban villa. When Eloise and Leonardo arrived, most people had already entered. As Eloise entered the villa's grand hall with Leonardo, all eyes turned to them. Although they appeared extremely calm on the surface, behind their backs, they were gossiping with those around them. Has Eloise got a new plaything again? This new bee seems to have some looks. Isn't that a given? Everyone Eloise chooses is good-looking. The surrounding discussions made Leonardo tense up, his expression turning colder. This was his first time standing beside her so openly and publicly. A peculiar anxiety and panic he couldn't quite explain, the gazes and looks that fell upon him like waves, gradually drowning him, making it hard to breathe. Cold sweat seeped out from his back, and even his complexion turned pale. At that moment, Eloise next to him suddenly spoke, "Are you scared?" Leonardo immediately snapped back to his senses, but didn't answer her question. "What are you afraid of?" "I'm here, aren't I?" The man turned his head to meet Eloise's gaze, his uneasy mood slowly calming. It was unknown when, but the woman's eyes had become his tranquilizer. "Where's Jim?" Leonardo changed the subject, quickly scanning the hall and soon spotted Jim, as well as the Jiang manager standing beside him. Looking around, the entire villa was filled with couples, and seeing Jim and the Jiang manager together suddenly felt a bit desolate. In fact, Eloise had originally called Jim to join them, but when she found out that Leonardo would also be going to Y City, she completely forgot about Jim. Eloise naturally saw Jim not far away, feeling a bit sorry for him, but between friendship and beauty, she would undoubtedly choose beauty. "Don't worry about him," Eloise said, just glancing once before looking away, quite heartless. QS Corporation had a luxury accessories brand. Some of the gem materials were sourced from the Bai family, so she had no reason not to attend the Bai family daughter's birthday party. Even so, it was mostly just a formality, showing her face in front of the Bai family head, and then there was nothing much left to do. Eloise soon felt bored and was about to leave with Leonardo when she noticed the man beside her suddenly stiffen. In the next instant, he turned pale, his face showing fear, as if he had seen something terrifying, frozen in place. Chapter 31. Eloise's expression tightened as she glanced in the direction Leonardo was looking, only to see a very ordinary couple, not appearing to have anything particularly unusual about them. "Leonardo," Eloise called out, her heart suddenly gripped with concern. However, the man seemed still lost in his own world, his pupils slightly unfocused, as if entranced. With a frown, Eloise couldn't help but reach out, disregarding the onlookers' gazes as she cupped the man's head and forcibly turned it towards her. "Leonardo, look at me." Their gazes met, and the man slowly came back to his senses, his lips pressed tightly together, his handsome brows furrowed, his slightly pale complexion somehow making him look particularly vulnerable. "What did you see?" Eloise asked, urgency creeping into her voice for the first time seeing Leonardo like this. "It's nothing," he replied, his expression now composed, as he pulled Eloise's hands away, his gaze wandering to the side, clearly indicating he did not wish to discuss it further. Seeing him like this, Eloise's expression darkened slightly, but just as she was about to lead Leonardo away, unexpectedly, the couple turned and approached them, their faces beaming with enthusiastic smiles. "Eloise, your reputation certainly precedes you," said the middle-aged man, his appearance unremarkable, his whole demeanor exuding the air of a nouveau riche, his smile laced with obsequiousness. Eloise subtly observed the man before her. At such gatherings, there were many who would approach her actively like him, and she usually brushed them off with a few words, unwilling to waste even a minute on such people. However, Leonardo's reaction was too bizarre, clearly related to this couple, so she naturally had to spend some time to investigate the situation clearly. "And you are?" she asked. The man seemed surprised that he could actually engage in conversation, and his face immediately lit up with delight, quickly introducing himself. "I am Lu Jian. Golden Mine Construction is my company." Eloise raised an eyebrow, her peripheral vision falling on Leonardo, whose gaze was fixed on the woman beside Lu Jian, a trace of barely perceptible hatred in his eyes. "And this is?" Curiosity growing. But on the surface, she showed none, asking naturally. "This is my wife," Lu Jian said, hastily signaling to the woman beside him. The woman beside Lu Jian seemed taken aback for a moment, her face lighting up with surprise, her voice tinged with excitement that was hard to suppress. "Hello, Eloise, I'm Miriam. I've heard before that Eloise is both talented and beautiful, and now that I see you in person, it's indeed true." "Madam, you flatter me." Eloise responded on the surface, but secretly, she scrutinized this woman named Miriam from head to toe. The woman in front of her looked to be about 40 years old, but because she was well-maintained, she appeared to be in her early 30s. The clothes and jewelry she wore were not cheap, but in the eyes of those who really knew their worth, they were nothing special. The woman's appearance was acceptable, and with makeup, she leaned towards the type of beautiful young matron, but her every move was tinged with a petty manner. Something within began to stir, but smart people usually preferred not to reveal their insights, and used a distant smile to conceal the disdain at the bottom of their hearts. "Eloise, who is this?" Lu Jian said, looking at Leonardo beside him, his expression not revealing anything, but the disdain in his eyes did not escape Eloise's notice. The corners of her mouth deepened, and a cold light began to taint her eyes. "This is a distinguished guest of my QS Corporation," Eloise said, ignoring the slight surprise on the person's side, taking a small step towards him, a clear sign of protection that made Lu Jian's expression stiffen. Lu Jian seemed like he wanted to ask something else, but Eloise had no more interest in playing along with him. Once she got the information she wanted, she brushed him off casually and left the villa with Leonardo, feeling that even a second's delay was a waste. In the quiet car, Eloise and Leonardo sat in the back seat, the partition pulled down, the closed space suddenly leaving only Eloise and Leonardo, while the driver was blocked outside by the partition. The atmosphere was eerily quiet, the man sitting there expressionless, his thoughts seemingly drifting elsewhere, while Eloise was also recalling the scene that had just happened in the villa, her expression somewhat heavy. The distance between the two was less than half a meter, but they each had their own thoughts, the atmosphere thus becoming somewhat awkward. After an unknown period of time, it was Eloise who finally spoke up, breaking the silence. "What did you see at the party?" As soon as the words fell, the man's eyes flickered, but he still showed no intention of speaking. After a moment, Eloise sighed softly, understanding his temperament. Her heart couldn't help but feel a bit helpless. However, just because Leonardo didn't say it, it didn't mean she had no way of finding out about this matter through other channels. "I'm hungry." Eloise suddenly changed the subject, the heavy atmosphere in the car lightening somewhat in an instant. Leonardo didn't react for a while, instinctively wanting to cook for her, but then remembered they were on their way back to the hotel. "What do you want to eat?" "I'll go buy it for you," he said. "No need," Eloise replied, crossing her legs, her skirt rising, revealing her fair thighs. I'll have someone bring dinner to your room later." Leonardo was puzzled, about to ask why, but Eloise seemed to know what he was thinking and explained, "You'll eat with me." The tone was unyielding, with a hint of arrogance, yet it somehow calmed the man's heart. Memories long sealed away broke through the surface upon meeting old acquaintances. He had thought he would have long forgotten some things, but it turned out he had never forgotten them. It was like a thorn, lodged deep in his heart, not painful if untouched, but once touched, it would hurt to the point of excruciating pain. His ears seemed to still echo with his mother's malicious curses and the occasional crazy ramblings, the empty house devoid of any warmth, filled only with despair, oppressive to the point of suffocation. His father's resolute back, his mother's enraged shouts, the indifferent gazes of those around him, all were unyielding and cold chains, dragging him into an endless abyss. He was so scared, really so scared. But fortunately, when the waves surged, someone grabbed him, saving him from sinking into the depths of the ocean, to perish in the icy waters. After returning to the hotel, Eloise first took a shower in her own room and changed her clothes before using the universal card to enter Leonardo's room without any hesitation. When Eloise entered the room, Leonardo was still in the bathroom taking a shower. The room was clean, everything neatly arranged. Eloise, in her slippers, slowly walked to the sofa, just about to sit down when her peripheral vision suddenly caught sight of the suitcase in the corner of the bed. Eloise didn't have the habit of rummaging through other people's personal belongings, but at this moment, the man's suitcase was wide open, not as she had seen it yesterday, tightly sealed in the corner. So much so that she was immediately attracted to the 2 boxes of medicine in the suitcase. Her brows slightly furrowed, Eloise stepped forward, bent down to pick up the 2 medicine boxes, and at first glance, her expression turned unimaginably somber. Secobarbital sodium, amitriptyline. Although Eloise didn't study medicine, she understood basic pharmacology, and she had also heard of the names and effects of these 2 medicines. One was a sleeping pill, the other, an antidepressant. Her grip on the medicine boxes tightened, her thoughts surging like a tidal wave. Her mind went blank for a moment, then shock mixed with anger arose from the depths of her heart, like a wave sweeping in, nearly drowning her heart. Her breathing paused for a moment, and a buzzing sounded in her ears. At this moment, she was overwhelmed with panic and helplessness, instinctively doubting and denying, but the medicine in her hand was a hard piece of evidence, forcing her to start believing in this incredibly bizarre fact. Her expression darkened. Eloise stood like a statue, stunned for a long, long time, until a knock came from the door, and only then did she come back to her senses, hastily placing the 2 medicine boxes back to their original position. It was the room service knocking. Eloise opened the door and then turned to sit back on the sofa, watching the waiter serve a plate of dishes that looked and smelled delicious, her mind a mess. The sound of running water in the bathroom still hadn't stopped, and Eloise sat on the sofa, her mood even more chaotic than the water sprayed out by the shower head. Leonardo, depression? A few seconds later, the woman's expression turned serious as she took out her phone to search for the effects of the 2 medicines she had just seen, and indeed, there was not much discrepancy from her initial assumption. Most importantly, these 2 medicines were prescription drugs. The fact she least wanted to accept was the one closest to the truth. For the first time, Eloise felt that the world could be so dramatic. In her impression, Leonardo was indeed not an optimistic person. On the contrary, his character was somewhat gloomy, occasionally even a bit sullen. Although his thoughts were quite sensitive, it was far from reaching the level of depression. She had heard that people with depression were not much different from ordinary people in daily life, but those were all deliberate disguises. Once the illness struck, it was a struggle with death itself. It was unimaginable what Leonardo had experienced in the places she couldn't see. Anger was present, but what was more was heartache and self-blame. Angry that he hadn't told her about his illness, heartbroken for all the pain he endured, blaming herself for not even noticing such abnormalities despite claiming to, him. Suddenly recalling Leonardo's odd behavior at the party, Eloise's expression grew louder. She knew Leonardo's background was complicated, and that he might be more withdrawn than the average person in such an environment. He had his stories, and she was willing to be his listener at any time. But at this moment, she found that she couldn't be indifferent anymore. She couldn't wait for the other party to open up on their own. She was eager to know what had happened to him. At this thought, Eloise fell silent for a moment, her expression more solemn than when faced with critical decisions at the company. A few seconds later, before Eloise could even reach for her phone to make a call, the room was filled with the sound of an incoming call. Glancing at the bedside table, she quickly averted her eyes the next second. Initially, Eloise wasn't too concerned, but when the call rang 3 times in a row, even after going unanswered, it seemed urgent. Worried something might be amiss, Eloise walked over to the bedside table, glanced at the phone screen, and saw an unknown number. She didn't hesitate and pressed the answer button. Before Eloise could speak, a torrent of angry shouts burst through the line. "Lad, don't you want to live anymore? Ignoring my calls on purpose, huh? You heartless wretch. We slaved to raise you, and this is the ingrate you turn out to be. Now your grandmother is seriously ill, bedridden, and unable to eat, and you can't even pick up the phone. Transfer $5,000 right now for your grandmother's treatment. Do you hear me?" Eloise felt a mix of anger and amusement at the caller's brazen attitude. In just a second, she guessed the situation and felt a surge of rage. When had the man she favored become someone others could bully at will? The anger was genuine, and decades of upbringing were momentarily forgotten. With a dark expression, she coldly spat out, "Moron." Then, she hung up, blocked the number, put the phone down, a series of actions done in a smooth 10 seconds. Eloise then returned to the sofa. Yet, the echoes of the man's shouts lingered, making Eloise more irritated. She felt the insult wasn't strong enough and had an urge to unblock him just to curse him again. However, her upbringing reasserted itself. She shouldn't be so childish. The best way to deal with such people wasn't through verbal sparring, but by making them regret their actions every moment. Clearly, the call was from Leonardo's nominal grandfather, and regardless of the truth about the grandmother's illness, his assertive tone suggested he was no stranger to such tactics. Moreover, his tone didn't treat Leonardo as a genuine family member. Toiling hard? She had investigated Leonardo before, and the reports only vaguely mentioned his past. It stated that Leonardo moved out at 18 and supported himself through tuition and living expenses. If those elders truly cared, they wouldn't have ignored him all these years, and Leonardo wouldn't have had to work multiple jobs until he collapsed outside a bar. Though it's possible Leonardo didn't want to trouble his family, from that call, she knew that toiling hard was just a pretext for exploitation. At that moment, the sound of water in the bathroom stopped. Within 5 minutes, the door opened, releasing a cloud of steam, and Leonardo appeared, wet-haired and dressed in a t-shirt and casual pants. Knowing Eloise had a key card, Leonardo wasn't surprised to see her in the room, just that she arrived faster than expected. Hearing the noise, Eloise masked her emotions, looking at Leonardo with her usual languid demeanor. Observing him completely dressed, she experienced an inexplicable sense of regret. Leonardo noticed the fleeting look in Eloise's eyes, recalling the scene in the changing room, his cheeks heating up as he mentally cursed her as a pervert, then calmly walked to the sofa, asking, "Why haven't you eaten yet?" Eloise took hold of his wrist, the warmth from his freshly bathed skin mixed with the scent of soap, uniquely pleasant on him. Leonardo often felt Eloise had a skin hunger, constantly seeking physical contact. It happened in the company's pantry, in the changing room, and now. Though he felt their relationship wasn't yet ready for such intimacy, he didn't resist. Just being near her seemed to follow his heart. During dinner, they spoke little. Eloise tried to act unaffected, yet her eyes kept returning to Leonardo, seeking clues in his demeanor. Leonardo remained oblivious, calling for the waiter to clear the dishes. When they sat back on the sofa, Eloise suddenly moved. Slowly, she knelt on the sofa, moving closer, eventually draping herself over him, engulfed in her familiar scent, comforting. Despite his body's tension, Leonardo relaxed in her embrace, accustomed to her bold actions. "What's wrong?" Leonardo asked, his voice gentle. Holding him tighter, Eloise, unseen, had a complex expression. "Feeling a bit tired lately," she said, revealing weariness. This vulnerability was new to Leonardo, who viewed Eloise as invincible, impervious in business and relationships. Yet here she was, leaning on him, saying she was tired. A hidden joy stirred, seeing a formidable beast expose its softest side, feeling trusted, secure. "Work issues?" Leonardo asked, his tone softer. His expression wasn't cold, his eyes were gentle, like spring water. "Yes, company troubles keep me awake at night," Eloise whispered, her breath teasing his collarbone, moving up to his ear. "Want to sleep together?" Leonardo jolted, his ears reddening, his expression tense with embarrassment. "Eloise!" His tone carried no reproach, rather it seemed to rise in volume out of embarrassment. "I'm serious, I can't sleep and have nightmares." Eloise abruptly released him, sitting apart. "You don't want to sleep with me, so why yell?" It was her usual tactic, pulling back after intense moments, leaving him half-empty. His expression cooled, and his eyes grew in resentment. "Sleep together?" How could she say such things so casually? Did she not understand its implications? "Guess I'll go home and suffer insomnia alone." Eloise stood, not seeming to care. As she took her first step, Leonardo abruptly stood, grabbed her hand, stopping her. Eloise met his stern gaze with a raised eyebrow, exuding confidence. "Go back to your room, I'll be there after drying my hair." Eloise's smile deepened, slipping a master key into his hand, teasing his chest on the way out. Waiting. 15 minutes later, Leonardo arrived at Eloise's room with the key. She lay in bed, his expression tightened. As he offered to sit at the foot, Eloise patted the spot beside her, inviting him closer. After a brief hesitation, he complied, sitting upright, a perfect escort. Eloise, amused, held his hand, intertwining fingers, then closed her eyes, resting. After 40 minutes, Eloise watched Leonardo, peacefully asleep, his innocent expression melting her heart. His grip on her hand was tight, as if needing reassurance. After a while, Eloise picked up her phone, her voice cold in the quiet room. "I need detailed records of Leonardo's life, every bit of information. Also, investigate a woman named Miriam. I want results within 3 days."